Welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time. I realize there's a lot going on. I'm not positive Senator Hayden's going to be here. I wanted him to talk about the governor's health care proposal, and I think we can probably figure it out without him, but just wanted to get together and talk to you about the disadvantage that the Senate is being put at in conference committee. The challenge becomes when bills don't get heard and the other side brings them to conference. The one body knows nothing about the provisions because there's been no public hearing, no public testimony by anybody. Our Senate counsel hasn't worked on the provisions. So it puts the Senate at a real disadvantage in conference. And I'm just a little bit concerned how the Senate is going to be able to effectively respond to some of the provisions the House is clearly going to bring in their budget bills to conference when we've had no opportunity even for our Senate council people to spend some time looking at it. And the one that's especially important to me, and we actually passed it in 2016, and it's paid family and medical leave. I just believe its time has come. And most of our large employers in Minnesota are providing for their employees. And it is the more middle-sized and smaller-sized businesses that just don't have the economies of scale that our big Fortune 500 companies type have that are going to be put in a tremendous competitive disadvantage in trying to recruit employees in what everyone says is a really, really tight labor market. You know, when you have a really, really tight labor market, sometimes it takes more than wages. It takes other working conditions to attract employees, maybe to switch employers. And the people that can offer that kind of a benefit, and many of our large companies do, are going to be put at a tremendous advantage, hiring advantage, going forward. So I've told the business community, both the chamber and the partnership, please get engaged on this subject. You know, unfortunately, those large companies, they don't need the state to put a program together. It's the more middle and smaller middle-sized companies that need to have some kind of a vehicle put in place to be able to provide that kind of a benefit. So I'm very serious about it. I said at the chamber dinner it's something I'm going to get done before I retire, and I'm hoping that in the conference committee we can get that discussion going. But it's going to be harder for the Senate conferees and harder for our Senate counsel because there's just been no conversation about it. And that doesn't mean the Senate would have to take up the bill and pass it to the floor or ever take it up. It's just let's have the conversation so that we can understand the provisions in the bill so that when we're presented them in a conference committee setting, the Senate conferees know something about it. And even at that, only the conferees will be engaged in the process, not all the members on the committee with jurisdiction. So it's just, I think it's just putting us at a disadvantage going into conference that we haven't had the conversation on a number of provisions. With that, I want to share the day with the Majority Leader of the House, Mr. Winkler.
Thank you. Good morning. The Minnesota House is ready to pass a budget for the people of Minnesota that reflects our shared values: affordable and accessible health care for ourselves and our neighbors, world-class schools for ourselves and our neighbors, a transportation system that works in our community and communities all across the state. The Minnesota House has repeatedly asked the Minnesota Senate leadership to have separate policy and budget bills, to take up bills related to sexual harassment, the Equal Rights Amendment, driver's licenses for all, even things that should be as universally as acceptable as a marital rape exception, to get rid of that in law. And we have been continually frustrated by the Senate's unwillingness to engage in open hearings on these issues and bring these bills to the floor for a vote. And as we look forward to the rest of session, it is time for the Minnesota Senate to get moving on some of these issues so at least we can have an open and fair debate, as Senator Bakk just described. And that goes for paid family and medical leave. It goes for the K-12 funding system, the One Care proposed by the governor. There's just a whole range of issues that Democrats are bringing, Governor Walz is bringing, the House DFL caucus is bringing, and if the Senate won't even engage in the discussion, it's very difficult to have a productive negotiation heading towards the end of session. So as we get ready to leave for our spring recess and come back to do the major budget bills when we return, remember, we have a May 1st deadline to get those bills off the floor and into conference, and a May 6th deadline to get targets from House and Senate leaders for those conference committees to get their work done. So the time to get this done is now, and it's time to start having more public hearings about these issues so that we can resolve them with the Minnesota Senate. And if we don't, we are looking towards a end of session gridlock that may end up being a very bumpy landing at best. And so I'd like to turn it over to Representative Hayden. Oh, Representative
Senator.
You've never even been a representative. I can't even make that mistake.
Well, I called you Mr. instead of
Good morning. I'm Susan Kent, State Senator representing Woodbury, Oakdale, and Maplewood, and I am Assistant DFL Leader in the Senate. And I want to thank you all for being here and helping advance this conversation, because that's the point of what we're trying to do. We all know that if we're going to work together to solve the major issues facing Minnesotans, it's helpful if we start from the point of our shared values. And there's no disagreement that helping all of our kids get a great start in life is one of those shared values. And a shared priority in order to get this done is to support our students when they're in school. We all, from both parties, acknowledge the major issues that our kids face: mental health challenges, information and affordability about post-secondary education options, family struggles with housing, food, and more. These and many other issues are real barriers to our kids' success and ultimately to the success of Minnesota. It is well documented that Minnesota schools have unacceptably low numbers of the professionals to support students and their families in addressing these challenges. Each of our school counselors, on average, is tasked with serving over 750 students. That is far above the national average of 450, not to mention the recommended number of 250. And when you consider the team of professionals who help students and families, counselors, plus social workers, psychologists, and nurses, Minnesota ranks dead last in investing in these important professionals. And this lack of investment has persisted for decades. This is an issue I've worked on since I took office, and I'm proud that we've developed an innovative, local control matching grant solution and began addressing this shortage a few years ago. I am very pleased that the House education budget includes more of these grants to school districts to hire new counselors, social workers, psychologists, and nurses. However, this bill has not been heard in the Senate, even though it has bipartisan authors. You will hear that the proposed Safe School revenue takes care of the problem. While this approach gives districts the option to use those funds to hire support professionals, we know from past spending history that most of those funds go to securing facilities, not hiring support professionals. It's a shame, frankly, and as I've advocated repeatedly in committee, we need to do both to truly support our students and to keep them safe. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Hi, I'm Senator Jeff Hayden, Senate District 62. Sorry I was late. I was in the Finance Committee wrestling with Senator Westrup about housing and making sure we have safe and fair housing throughout our state. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about. I wanted to just highlight a little bit about the health care issues. I'm the lead Democrat on the Human Service Reform and also serve on the HHS committee, as I've had since I've been in the House. One of the things that we want to highlight is the lack of opportunity for us to fully explore in the Senate the governor's one care proposition, the idea that we're going to be able to buy into Minnesota Care, if you will, and be able to give people more access at a cost that makes sense for Minnesotans who are desperately needing health care. And frankly, the obsession of my friends, Senator Benson in particular, about propping up the individual market. I will point out that just a couple of weeks ago, some of you guys reported on that the insurance market and the individual market made a record profit of I don't know if it's a record or not, but it's a lot of money, $197 million. And in the public sector, they made $106 million, and we gave them $104 million in reinsurance. So you don't have to be good at math to understand that we're propping up the insurance companies under the guise that they're going to raise the rates if we don't. So the governor's proposal really gets at that issue. And if there is a rise in the individual market, they propose that you give a premium subsidy directly to the consumers along with a tax break We haven't been able to fully vet this conversation on the bill that was unveiled yesterday. There was pretty much schemes, and it reminds me of when we served together in the House under Governor Pawlenty, where there was shifts and schemes and money pushed into the health care access that looks like you're spending on health care, then pushed out in order to prop up reinsurance, and then leave massive holes in our general fund. There's over a $400 million deficit in the tails, 300 that we have to find cut in health and human service. So when you hear people say that they really care about the vulnerable people in Minnesota, 70% of that budget is the elderly and disabled. There are cuts, actual cuts to those vulnerable people. In addition to that, Senator Abler proposed that we cut the CCAP. That's what goes to vulnerable children, low-income children. And then there was a restoral of money that was still short of the goal, and there's a gap in the funding source. And then we have to go out and talk to the feds to see if we get federal waivers for things that have never been done. It's incomplete. It doesn't work. We should have heard the governor's proposals. We should have gotten a good opportunity that if we are going to invest in Minnesota, we should invest directly into the consumers, directly into our constituents, and not this continued propping up and giving money directly to insurance companies, which, by the way, are transferring money out to for-profit entities and entities outside of the state. So now that we're allowing for-profit health insurers in, they're creating those, and they're taking good, hard-earned Minnesotans' monies and sending it to either that or to nonprofits outside the state.
Questions?
The first command of the Constitution is to protect public safety. The Senate passed a public safety judiciary bill that's got 11% of the funding that the governor asked for. It doesn't fund constitutionally mandated health care for inmates. It doesn't fund the courts, at least the request that they have. It only brings in about 66 corrections officers. It falls so short that the committee chair himself complained that this was an unconstitutional bill, and yet they passed it. Is this honest budgeting? The chair of the committee says they're going to have to lift this up in conference committee, that some of these things will be put back in conference committee. Is this an honest process?
Well, let me try. You know, at the risk of offending almost everybody, it's always some level of risk in saying what your number one priorities are. But I just got to tell you, those corrections officers that work in our prisons, they're state employees. They're the employees of the legislature because we're the ones that appropriate the money that they get paid with. And the thought that corrections officers, when they go out the door in the morning and leave their family behind, those families are scared for their safety at work, that is serious business. You know, we had 2 corrections officers killed last year at work, our employees. No employer in Minnesota would do nothing about that. Something has to be done. It's going to take more revenue than is in that entire target, and that entire target includes the courts. So that is the one area that really bothers me, because I feel some responsibility for public employees when they go to work in the morning to make sure they have a safe work environment to work in so that they come home at the end of the day. And I'm very concerned. The path that we're on, we are not going to be able to accomplish that. And I think as the employer, it's our responsibility.
I'd just like to add that it is not the Democratic Party's responsibility alone to fund the core functions of government. That is a shared responsibility. Republican Senate leadership and House Democratic leadership have to start from a foundation of an honest budget that is actually balanced and a basic commitment to fund the core functions of government like the courts and the correction system and public safety. If we're starting from a position where they think they can bring bills to conference that don't actually do their basic job, and that we're going to negotiate with them to the point of getting to the middle, which is that the government stays open, that is a recipe for failure. And that is not how we are going to approach this. We can have differences of opinion about how large the state budget should be, how much revenue needs to be brought in. We can have a whole range of discussions. But a balanced budget that is not filled with shifts and gimmicks and false numbers and that performs the duties of providing basic core functions of the government is something that we both have to bring to the table initially. And that's what our expectation is.
So you're suggesting that their idea or strategy is to bring starting points into conference that are so low that this is a strategy to try to bring you guys down. The middle suddenly becomes a lot lower than it otherwise would if they brought in sort of honest baseline kind of spending. I mean, you're talking about what you think their strategy is, correct?
I would say they've been very honest about that. You know, when you listen to them in committee, I spent yesterday in E12 and transportation, and I thought it was sort of ironic that in E12, where in the Senate they're saying 0.5% and 0.5% increase on the base formula, which will leave all of our districts, I believe, in a really bad situation to either make severe cuts or to have to go back to local property taxpayers to make up the difference. And they acknowledged it as much in committee. And I sit next to Senator Chamberlain, the tax chair, and we were discussing the nature of that target. And he himself acknowledged, we're broke, right? We don't have the funds to do this. Then he went to transportation, where the chair is arguing we need to use general fund money that apparently we don't actually have to fund our roads and bridges. So they're not even being, you know, trying to pretend this is legitimate. This is clearly, you know, an unworkable set of priorities that they've established.
And the point is, you don't have to agree with the DFL House budget. You don't have to agree with the DFL House budget, but it is honest. We are honestly raising revenue to fund the priorities of Minnesotans and paying for the things that we say are important. Starting from a position of moving money around, shifting funds from here to there, claiming you can find savings that will never appear, having a disaster account that says that they will appropriate $20 million should $20 million happen to be on the bottom line is not a budget. And it's not an opening position in negotiations.
Let me say this. It happened also in the HSR. Senator Lori came and basically very bluntly said that not only will this bill not become law, it doesn't work. It doesn't follow the practice and the laws. Senator Abler said on the record that this is not a bill he would vote for. So he said on the record as the chair, this is not a bill that he votes for. So to your point, he characterized it as a starting point, as some ideas that he's kicking around, and then we'll see what happens when we get to conference committee. So it isn't like us kind of theoretically thinking that that's where they're at as a strategy. That is specifically what they said.
The rationale that was expressed to me is that there's again, I'm returning that one budget, but it's, I think, exemplifies the rest of the budget process. That there's a 9.6% rise in spending in that particular division. That was characterized as extreme. This is a reaction to another extreme move on the part of the Democrats. How do you respond to that?
Are you talking in the healthcare budget? Or just in general? Oh, across the board. I'll let the speaker and others and Tom talk about that a bit.
Let me try. I cannot tell you, I can remember a time when one of the bodies rolled out their budget, they didn't compare it to the February forecast. Current law. The February forecast is current law. Instead, they decided to compare it to the spending in the last biennium, the biennium we're in, the money we actually appropriated. That is just not accurate. And here's my example. So if we put, in the last biennium, we put 2% and 2% on the K-12 formula. So that is 2%, and then that carries into the second year, so it's 4% in the second year. So it's a total of 6% of spending for K-12 in the current biennium. In the February forecast, because when that carries forward into the next biennium, you can't use the numbers from the previous one because the 2% that you spent in the second year of the biennium carries forward now. So in the biennium we're going into, the education spending under current law is 8%, not 6%. So they're trying to compare it to the appropriations made in the previous biennium. The appropriations in the previous biennium don't reflect current law. So, I mean, and that is all over the budget. When you make appropriations in the first year and the second year, they both carry through into the next biennium. But when you ignore the fact that they compound, it's just not honest accounting. You have to compare your budget to the February forecast because that's current law. The February forecast is what actually interprets the cost of what you did in the previous biennium. So it's they're starting from the wrong place to to carry forward a percentage and increase in spending. Because if you portray it to what we appropriated, it inflates the numbers significantly.
One more question?
Let's let this run a little bit. We're all here together. Let's let it run a little bit. Somebody else have a question?
Yeah, I mean, the Senate GOP is out with a statement today. You know, they're listing several bills that they say have bipartisan support that haven't gotten a vote on yours in the House. They're mentioning reinsurance, deputy registrars, preventing future illegal delays on line 3, pharmacy benefit managers, hospital billing transparency, direct primary care agreements. I mean, they've got priorities they'd like to see votes on that haven't really moved in the House.
Most of those things have been heard in the Minnesota House. The pharmacy benefit manager bill was heard yesterday. There was a hearing on reinsurance in the Commerce Committee, and the bill was moved out of Commerce. The deputy registrars is in the transportation bill, so that's just factually not accurate.
Well, one that is accurate, I think, though, is the 20-week abortion ban, which is going to come over in Benson's health omnibus. You guys haven't heard it, I assume because you completely disagree with it. Why should they hear things that they completely disagree with?
Well, the bodies need to hear bills. But chairmen owe it to members. You know, we all paid our $100 and we all have our election certificate. And when a member introduces a bill, they ought to get the courtesy of a hearing. Now, the chair doesn't have to have a vote on it, but at least give the member the courtesy of a hearing so he can bring in his testifiers. And I'll just say it. Senator Little, for example, and I've talked with Senator Gazelka about this. This is his second session, and he has not had one bill heard yet. Not one. And he's introduced a whole bunch of bills. That's just not the collegial nature of the Senate. And I've had a conversation with Senator Gazelka about this. He understands that that's a problem. Indicated to me that next year will be different for Senator Little. I don't know how many bills Senator Kent has had heard. 2 in 2 years. You know, we all have constituents to represent that have ideas, and we ought to, with our election certificate, bring it to the table so that people can come and testify as to why they think it's a good idea. Otherwise, large swaths of people get cut out of the process. Not that you have to pass them. But the problem with not hearing them, like I said earlier, is you get to conference committee and you got these side-by-sides and you got big white spots across from things. And how can you have a negotiations when the one side doesn't know anything about the provision on the other side? So.
And there is a difference. There is a difference between not hearing a bill on abortion in a pro-choice body that's coming over from the other body. The Minnesota Senate has refused to hear vast swaths of the governor's budget. And we're talking about the money that we're appropriating to run the state, basic government functioning, the way the governor proposes to spend education revenue, the way the governor proposes to deal with health care. Just having kind of show hearings or not hearing at all vast swaths of the governor's budget is really a different matter than us not treading into ideological territory. I can understand them not hearing some bills of an ideological nature, but when we're talking about the functioning of the financial picture of the state. Example, President Trump talked about paid family leave in the State of the Union. It's time to have a conversation about whether we should do that and if we do it, how to do it. As Senator Bakk said, to put small and medium employers on a level playing field with the big companies who can afford to do it without any government program to help them carry it out for their employees. So I think you're comparing apples and pineapples. What we're talking about here is taking a serious look at the state budget and having a serious examination of the way that the pieces of the budget should function. You can't go into a conference committee on the health care budget and not really understand what does this one care proposal look like and how would it work.
And I would add the same thing about transportation in the Senate. We did not hear the governor's proposal about that hugely important part of our infrastructure. Senator Newman, by request, as he put it, put forward just the 3 funding mechanisms for roads and bridges. That's it. There was none of what those things would do. There was no discussion about the actual needs of transportation. It was purely a show hearing to try to only put the light on the revenue side of it without talking about what's really going on with our infrastructure. So it's not a meaningful conversation if we're not actually talking about solving the problem.
Is there no vote of protest for the process?
Yes, and I made that clear.
Don't they have you over a barrel, though, on reinsurance? I mean, you remember 2018, 2020, a lot of the campaign attacks against Democrats are going to be about the high cost of the individual market. So
John, they made $197 million. They made $197 million. We gave them 154. So the lack of transparency in the insurance companies and the amount of money that insurance companies are making, it suggests us, they said the sky was going to fall in. Well, actually it didn't. They made a whole bunch of money and then took that money and sent it to other places. So no, they don't have us over a barrel on that. We think that if there is going to be an issue, if the individual market is going, if prices are going to rise, and we don't always know the reason why, but if they are, we have a plan for that. We're going to give the money to the people to offset the cost.
Will people participate in the premium discount, the premium help that you're going to give?
Well, we think so. And remember, people up to 200%, that's Minnesota Care, 200 to 400, they get the APTC from the feds, right? So now we're going to kind of 400 and above, and we believe that those are really smart people. They're making a few dollars, which usually says that they're, you know, that they understand how this works, and we think they'll participate. And let me be clear, what we did before, we had to get that done at the end. It was in January. So it closed in the 31st. So we think the lack of participation for some of those folks was they had already made their health care decisions. In this case, we don't have that problem. So we would rather, if we are going to have a spike in the individual market, if the sky is going to fall on this market, then we'd rather be able to offset that by giving the money directly to the people.
Senator Benson, though, said yesterday that she doesn't think DHS can handle it with the data breaches and the IT struggles for any kind of expansion of a public program that the state agency would handle due to problems over the past 5 years.
Well, I think Senator Benson is kind of, you know, there's a lot of hyperbole around. We have antiquated systems that we're not putting the money into to raise them. We've worked out a lot of the issues that we've had with MNsure. We've had a record number of people enroll in MNsure. We talked to the MNsure CEO. Their call times are within industry standards. Their IT response is working very well. So I think that what we like to do is we like to say, listen, it didn't work 4 or 5 years ago, and we're just going to keep banging that drum. And as it comes to data breaches, and I'm not an expert of that, but almost every day to the largest companies in this world are reporting that they had a data breach of some sort that they're trying to fix. So I don't excuse if there's a data breach at DHS, but boy, Apple and all, and I don't want to name them because I don't want to get myself in trouble if I name the wrong one. But you guys are in the media. You report on this every single day, or at least every single week. Somebody says somebody is kind of trying to figure out how to get into systems, and it happens all the time. And we're acknowledging it, we're fixing it. There is a lot of requests in the governor's budget in order to upgrade the system so that we can make sure that these things don't happen.
So is this financing discrepancy largely or all about tax cuts?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
No.
Well, it's a tax question, so let me try.
Yeah, it's all about tax cuts, man.
This is not a hard session to put together. It's just not. I mean, there's $1 billion of one-time money. That's pretty significant. I mean, you need to be careful you don't spend that beyond the tails so that we don't end up in a shortfall. But all we really would have to do is what we've kind of always done in the tax committee, conform with federal tax changes. I mean, the CPAs kick us around the room every time the feds make some federal tax changes and say you have to conform. You have to conform to what the federal government did. That's all we need to do. If we conform to what the federal government did, I would bet you there's going to be enough money to put a real solid budget together that invests in Minnesota over the next 2 years. That's all you have to do, and include the $1 billion of one-time money. Not hard. It's what we've always done. We have always conformed. Some outlying provisions maybe, but generally we've conformed to the federal tax changes, and we could go home early, Madam Speaker.
President Trump is coming on Monday to talk about taxes. Anybody want to comment on that?
Well, I kind of have a thought on that. Why he's coming to Minnesota? Because Minnesota got a really bad deal, and he knows it, right? He knows it. I mean, Minnesota, California, New York got a really, really bad deal, and there might be a couple of other states with the cap on the state and local deductions on our property taxes and our income tax. It was a pretty bad bill for Minnesota. So I think he's coming here. I mean, on the last day you can file, he's coming here to try and put a smiley face on a real pig that Minnesota got handed.
All right, thank you.
One question.
Thank you, guys.
Just one quick question. Big picture, you're leaving tomorrow.
there's been chasms between the budget. It sounds like you don't even agree on the baseline numbers. Are you getting concerned about getting this done in time?
No. There's a lot of time left. We had a very, Senator Gazelka and I had a very good meeting Tuesday of this week and a good discussion yesterday. So I'm still optimistic that we're ahead of schedule and we'll finish on time.
Did he respond to your letter?
He did. We're working on the details. We'll let you know.